this record button. All right, episode 12, New England Sports Media Podcast. Britni Cretaz is with us, a freelance writer who's been published just about in every cool outlet you can imagine, working on a book. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, first, let's get into I want to talk about your book that you're working on. Can you kind of just tell the listeners of this podcast what that is going to look like and when it's coming out and kind of how it all came together?
Yeah, so I'm working on the book with another sports writer, Lindsay Darkangelo, who writes a lot for The Athletic. And we are really excited about it. It is hopefully publishing fall 2021, so in about a year, but with quarantine stuff, that is TBD. It is about the National Women's Football League, which was the first professional women's football league in the United States. They played in the 1970s and 1980s. At their height, there were 14 teams and 3 divisions. Over 300 women played in the league. And we are telling the story of that league, which includes the winningest pro football team in history, men's and women's. And also putting it in the cultural context of the time it existed. So looking at it in the context of the women's liberation movement, Title IX and the Battle of the Sexes, queer liberation post-Stonewall, and kind of all of the things that came together to kind of create the perfect storm for this league to exist when it did.
What was the league like? Like, where did they play? How big were the teams?
The teams varied, so every team was incredibly different, but the teams were concentrated mostly in the Midwest and the South, with a few teams out west. So several Ohio teams, Michigan, Oklahoma, Texas, Detroit were the major kind of hubs, and the teams that tended to last the longest were in those places. And they were full teams. I mean, I think it speaks to such a lack of opportunity for women. And if you think about football in particular, which has also been a men's sport, considered a men's sport for a long time, even though that's actually not true when you look at the history of it. But girls don't grow up with the opportunity to play, Pop Warner or football as kids. And so while a lot of the women were athletes, they played collegiate sports, they were softball players, track stars, they had never really had the opportunity to play organized football before. So when they saw this ad that they could come out for a pro football team, a lot of women jumped at the chance. Most of the teams had upwards of 100 women showing up just off a newspaper ad to try out for these teams because it was something that they never imagined was even going to be a possibility for them.
And what gave you the inspiration to pursue this project?
I stumbled upon the league when I first read about the Toledo Troopers, and that's the team that I mentioned as being the winningest team in pro football history. Their record is disputed because records on the league aren't great, but they won anywhere between 59 and 64 games in 9 seasons while only losing 4. So they were a really dominant team, and their star halfback, Linda Jefferson, was on the cover of Billie Jean King's women's sports magazine in the 70s. And I came across this cover and I read about the team and was like, this is really cool. And then I read a little bit more about the team and thought, there must have been other teams in this league. Who were they playing, right? And the more I read, the more I realized that aside from, local features in little papers every 10 years or so, none of the teams had really been written about, and there was no comprehensive history of the league. And the book deal came, I used to have a column at Long Reads about sports, and it was kind of loosely based on the idea of losing and telling sports stories from the losing point of view. And I wrote about what happens when the winningest team of all time loses a game for the first time. And I recreated the first time the Troopers lost a game in their 6th season of play. And that story ended up becoming the basis for our book proposal. And at the time, Lindsay and I were already working on a proposal about women's football, and that book did not sell. And so we were able to rework that proposal to actually center on this league using the research I'd done for that story.
So oftentimes we ask people on this podcast a pretty similar question, but this one I'm very curious about. Your answer to this question is, how do you go about reporting a book like this and doing the interviews and finding people when, like you said, there is no comprehensive history and you're working on the comprehensive history, especially like you said, 70s, 80s, like there's no internet, like, you know, like there's no, you can't just look up football reference for that league. So how do you go about finding these people, contacting them and putting it all together?
It's a little bit like dominoes. When you find one, you find another. And because the Troopers have been written about a little bit and they were my starting point, what happens from there is you get in touch with one and they put you in touch with another. But the bulk of my reporting came from going into newspaper archives, and what they are not reliable for is the player quotes and perspectives, because they're often told through the lens of the person writing the story, and they're often men in the 70s basically mocking the women who are playing, sometimes wholesale making up whatever they want, but they are reliable for the names of players and, you know, box scores, essentially the gamers. So I'm able to build off of that. And so you just sort of start writing names that appear in newspaper articles, and you find them. And once you find the women, it turns out many of them have saved literally everything. And they send me game programs, rosters, yearbooks, photos, all of that have just been sitting, essentially waiting for somebody to ask them about it for, almost 50 years. So the women themselves have those stories. But I will say that sometimes it takes me 2 years to get in touch with someone. Linda Jefferson, it took me almost 2 years to get in touch with her. I tried for that long read story about the Troopers losing and could not find her. I talked to some of her teammates, but never was able to connect with her. And I tried again when I wrote about Women's Sports Magazine, because I wanted to talk about her cover and I couldn't get in touch with her. And then I found her niece on Facebook, and her niece was like, sure, I'll tell my aunt. And then, I randomly got a call from a Toledo, Ohio number. And I was like, oh my God, and she's like, hi, I heard you've been looking for me. I'm like, yes, I have. So those are the moments that are really cool, but it's really just a lot like detective work and a puzzle, and you find clues in these like really unexpected places. And it's taking the memories that these players have of the games and then looking back at game scores and the weather on that day and trying to figure out exactly which game they're talking about and recreating it.
Now, you're from like Southern Florida. How'd you kind of come to New England? Why'd you come to New England? And how do you kind of see yourself in this landscape? I know you have done some award-winning stories while you've been in New England. And how do you kind of like use your time and approach your freelance career up here?
I came to Boston for college. I went to Northeastern. And aside from 2 years that I went back to Florida for grad school, I've been in Boston ever since. It absolutely feels like home. I also grew up loving New England sports because, well, Red Sox baseball, really, because South Florida, we didn't have a team when I was little. The Marlins were not around yet. So by the time they were, and they're my NL team, I already had a rooting interest in the Red Sox because my mom's family was from here. And my grandpa, taught me to yell Yankee suck at my dad, who was a Yankees fan. And so I think those two things have felt really natural for me. I stay here because I love it. And also I think, real talk, in the current administration and the way things are going, it is one of the safest states to be queer and trans, and that impacts me and my family. So it's definitely not somewhere I plan on leaving anytime soon.
And you mentioned before you came on, you were working on like an article. Talk a little about the freelance life. Like, What's that like? How do you pitch articles? Do you have outlets contacting you?
Well, the answer now is very different than when I started. And I will say that I don't have a formal journalism degree. I did not go to school for this. I literally elbowed my way in by deciding that this was what I wanted to write about and then convincing people that I could do it. Um, I think it can be a really like daunting process to start freelancing because it's so opaque. Nobody tells you how to pitch or who to contact. I found a lot of that out through like Facebook groups for writers, and I just read everything I could, and following editors on Twitter who were looking for pitch calls. And responding to those. Because I didn't have a journalism background, and a lot of times they require clips, which are like published work, in order to accept a pitch. I got published by writing personal essays so that I had clips, and then I started writing reported essays where I was actually learning to report based on my personal experience, and I was able to leverage those into actual reporting jobs. So honestly, I think I just have the personality for freelancing. I'm really stubborn and incredibly persistent. You mentioned, an award-winning story. I received an award for a story I had written in 2017 about racism in Boston sports talk radio. That story was turned down, quite a bit before it found a home. And for the same publication, I went to Red Sox women's fantasy camp the next year. I pitched that story like 30 times before it was accepted. I tend to take a no as an I'm going to show you that this is a great story and you're wrong. I think that serves me really well in, freelance life. But I'm like incredibly persistent. And right now, because I'm working on a book, I'm not pitching as much. But there are times, especially at the beginning, where I was sending 10 pitches a week to just have as many balls in the air as I could. This is what I do full time, and trying to cobble together a living doing that is really hard. Right now, I will say I write a few days a week for Refinery 29, doing like quick news hits, which is the consistent income, because with freelancing, it's often 3 to 4 months before I see the money from a story. And I'm also at the place in my career where more editors are approaching me and offering me assignments, and I do not have to actively pitch as much as I did at the beginning.
So when you were at Northeastern, were you interested in journalism, or did this come after you already graduated?
I didn't know what I was interested in. I don't know, like I was 18, right? And you're asked to pick a major. And I will say that at the time, I did not know, like, so I'm an alcoholic, and that picked up for me really badly in college. And I'm in recovery now, but a large part of, even before my drinking got really bad, a large part of that was just like a general ambivalence about everything. And I could not have told you what I liked. I could tell you what I hated, which was like everything, but I didn't know what I actually liked. And so I picked psychology as my major because it had the fewest math requirements, and it had seemed easy when I took a class in high school. That was literally the extent of how much thought went into my college major. And then I went to grad school because I didn't think I could work full time and drink as much as I wanted to, which was true. And I got my master's degree in mental health counseling because it was the logical next step from a psychology degree. I was a social worker before I went into journalism. I didn't hate social work. I was pretty good at it, but it never quite fit. I also have some like chronic health stuff that makes my fatigue really bad and functioning not great. And so the schedule never really worked for me. But journalism ended up being a happy accident. I had always written blogs for fun and had really enjoyed it. I had an anonymous blog when I was in college, and it taught me how to write for an audience, actually. I think a lot of times journalists and people in the journalism field turn their nose up at blogging, but I always tell people that blogging proves that you know how to write for an audience, and that you, especially if you have like a blog that you've established over time, you can stick to a publishing schedule. You can find stories, you can figure out angles, you can find your voice. Those are all things that I think like blogging helped me do, but it was always a hobby. And then I ended up getting laid off from my job. Well, not laid off, more like pushed out while I was on maternity leave with my first child. And a friend of mine was like, I've read your writing, you're really good. Have you ever considered getting paid to write? And I was like, what? Who's going to pay me to write? I've never taken a writing class in my life. But I said yes, and things have moved pretty fast. My daughter was born in 2014, so I've been freelancing full time for 5 years, and that's the only time I've been, professionally writing as well. So it's been a pretty like fast trajectory for me.
When like you said, your persistence and when you get a story that they don't want, you make them want it. What percentage of the time do you have a story, like a longer story, fully written and reported without a home?
I don't usually. The only time that I would have like a fully reported story without a home would be if it got killed by another outlet. I tend to not write and report stories unless I know I can sell it, because my time is my money and it ends up being a waste. What I will do is put out feelers and do just enough reporting so that I can sell the story, because I need to be able to pitch it. They need to know what they're buying from me, essentially. Like, pitching is sales. And they often, especially in the long form features like I tend to write, they're based around like a character or, somebody that the reader is going to want to invest in. And I need to have enough information about that. So usually I have identified my main character and know a little bit about them, and have usually done a little bit of background information, like background research about the larger picture, right? Because I'm telling the story of this person in a larger context. How does this person's story reflect a larger issue? So those are the two pieces I usually have to pitch a story. Who am I writing about, and what's interesting about them, and what does their story say about this larger issue that affects other people too?
So with the story you were talking about earlier, like the racism in Boston sports media, when you went into that, like, what was the goal of that piece, you think?
That piece was written in frustration. So we're talking about New England media, so I'm assuming listeners are familiar with WEEI. And so the piece was about WEEI, and in particular its morning show. I pitched it at the nexus of like several things. That morning show is consistently like the highest rated talk radio show in the country, which to me proved that there was an audience for what I and many other people consider to be incredibly offensive content. The people I was writing about at the time, Jerry Callahan and Kirk Minahan, are no longer there. But that show had been on the air for a very long time, and is offensive is like a nice way of putting it, I would say. So that show existed as the #1 rated show at a time when we were having that argument about renaming Yawkey Way, and then someone used a racial slur towards Adam Jones when he was playing at Fenway. And as a result of that, the governor and the mayor came out and said, this is not who we are. Boston is not racist. Boston is welcoming, and this is not reflective of us as a city. And I'm like, yeah, but is it? Because if we're looking at the ratings of this show, and plus all of the other things that we know to be true about Boston's history, the Red Sox's history, and just the United States in general, probably this is who we are. But I felt like there was some piece connecting this morning show, this this radio show that had such high ratings, literally proving there was an audience for this kind of offensive drivel, that kind of disproved the idea that no, Boston is very welcoming, and this is not who we are. So that was sort of the cultural climate that story was pitched in. It ended up being explosive, for probably the main reason is because the Red Sox went on the record with me admitting that the morning show was offensive. And the Red Sox and WEI are broadcast partners. WEI airs Red Sox games. So for them to say that, I think, and to take an actual like stance against content that aired on their broadcast partner was a very big deal. I think they had to, because again, we're in this comment. It was immediately post Charlottesville. Like literally they hadn't responded to oh, that's funny. I just remembered this. They hadn't responded to my media inquiries for comment, and Charlottesville happened that weekend. And I woke up Monday morning with that statement in my inbox. And so I think there was a cultural shift happening in which they felt like they needed to say something. But that was a really, really big deal. It also pushed, I wrote for DigBoston, which is our alt weekly and doesn't have a lot of readers. But because of that statement, and the piece gained a lot of attention. Kirk Minahan had a meltdown on air that week that it ran. He called Sam Kennedy a pandering vomit. He got taken off the air for a week. And a lot of things, like I actually see that story as the catalyst for a lot of things that changed at WEI. Kirk has, in not as explicit terms, but has hinted at that being the beginning of the end of his career at WEI. He's now at Barstool, which tells you I was not wrong about the content. And so I think, this is about a question of what was the goal of that story. And so it was taking these like larger conversations that were happening and bringing these pieces together, saying things that maybe people had been saying for a long time, but we had a new lens to look at it through. And to me, I consider that story a really big success, because I do think it had concrete impacts and it has reverberated in the sports media landscape.
When you finished that story, what was like the reaction like coming towards you? Like I know that, I mean, I think everyone, if they do any sort of story that sparks any sort of controversy, you're going to get Twitter hate, you're going to get other hate. I know that you're pretty big on Twitter too. You got like, a good amount of followers, a good amount of people that interact with you. Like, how do you what was the reaction? How do you kind of like deal with it?
The reaction, oh God. So I'd say, as I compared, I mentioned that Kirk left EEI and is now at Barstool, and I'd say the listening base for that is sort of like a circle. Like the Venn diagram for like those audiences are basically a circle. So the amount of like vitriol and hate and trolling and threats that I got were incredibly bad. My editors at the Dig were incredible. And I will say, like, as a freelancer, when you're writing stories like that, you want to make sure the publication you're writing for is going to have your back and is not going to throw you to the wolves. I had written for like a mainstream magazine once, a personal story that a tabloid picked up and like twisted and took out of context. And it was horrible. And the legal department there was just like, but isn't it great? It's going viral. It's getting so many views. Like, that was horrible to deal with. And so now when I do write stories that I think might be controversial or might bring blowback on me, I'm really, really cautious about who I write them for. And so I think the Dig on a lot of levels was like, this is a small publication, but it was the right editor, and it was a group of people who really stood behind me. They offered to hire like a private security detail for my home if I needed it, because I was that scared. So that was from, the audience, but then the journalism community as well there's a show called Beat the Press that airs on WGBH, which is like our local PBS station. And they talked about my story, and they're, all like established New England, Boston journalists. They said that it was poorly reported, while then like using things from my story to explain why it should have been written, while not mentioning that actually, no, this was my reporting that they were citing. And then somebody brought up the harassment I was experiencing as being, unacceptable. And one of the other women on the panel said I brought it on myself. And I had to deal with, like, even journalists were not supporting me. Privately, men in sports media were messaging me and saying, our paper should have covered this. We should have been on this. Good story. But publicly, they were not coming out and having my back. And I was a woman, a freelancer without institutional support, new to the field. The only person in Boston sports media that man who publicly supported me was Evan Drellick, who actually filled Kirk's spot on the morning show while Kirk was off the air. And, he's the only one that was like, hey, like, we should probably not be talking about this person this way. And I have, I have since established a professional relationship with Evan and told him how much that meant to me, because he was literally the only one with any institutional backing who was willing to stand up for me in my reporting. So I will say that when I found out that story was one of the notables in the back of Best American Sports Writing that year, and when I found out, I pulled over and called my editor and was sobbing, because it was like just some validation that it had been worth the, like, just hate had been worth it. And that at least it got this like sliver of recognition, that it had been, done well. And it was probably my first long form piece of reporting too that I'd ever done. And so I kind of didn't know what I was doing.
And when you got that, like, that, I guess that you kind of talked about how like Dig's kind of like not like the mainstream media, is kind of like an all, like you said, is all weekly, but there was some reaction from the mainstream media, but like the best sports writing book, like that's probably like mostly mainstream stories going into that. Like how are you able to kind of, and you've written for a lot of mainstream places, how are you able to kind of fit yourself into all these different like types of outlets, and you're able to do the mainstream stuff, like you've written for, the Washington Post, Boston Herald, like all kinds of stuff like that, but also these other things. How are you able to kind of like, or do you have to change your writing style at all for those publications?
Yeah, totally. I think part of what makes me a successful freelancer is that I can tailor my stories to a publication, and I'm really good at being creative and figuring out how my story fits for an audience. And I say often that my work fits in this like gray area, because I write about sports, but I write about like women and queer athletes. And so sports publications consider me like a women's interest writer, and women's publications consider me a sports writer, and neither really consider that what their audience wants. And so my job is to like show publications how the story I want to tell actually does fit for their audience, and finding unique ways in. Like I was in the New York Times. I've written for them 3 times, and none of those pieces were actually in the sports section. I wrote about brain injury in tackle football for girls, and I pitched that to the Well Family section because it was about youth sports and health. And when it ran in print on Super Bowl Sunday, which was incredibly exciting, it ran in the sports section, but that is not the section that commissioned it from me. It was actually the Well Family section. Similarly, I wrote about ballpark proposals or just Jumbotron proposals, and that ran in the style section, in the vows section, because it was about an engagement. And so I was able to write it for the weddings section. And then I wrote about like aesthetics in women's basketball and how players are using social media to kind of shake off a lot of the homophobic norms that have been placed on women athletes for a really long time. And that ran an opinion. So because it was an op-ed. So I am really creative about where I'm pitching stories and trying to find those ways in that are unique. And also I think because of that, it doesn't make me a like one more story in a sea of pitches these people are getting, because there's something about my story that's different because I've tried to find like an odd way in.
What was the ballpark proposals article about? What was the inspiration for that?
That piece is, I'll tell you, it's funny because I wrote it initially wondering like why ballpark proposals and jumbotron proposals are still a thing, when every time they happen my entire social media feed is like, you know, public proposals are horrible, and then you have people writing about them from a lens of like consent and coercion and, you know, traditional ideas of gender roles, and is there even a place for them anymore, is where the idea of it came from. And reporting it was actually really interesting because it changed my mind a little bit, because I interviewed people who actually had these proposals, and they were all just so freaking happy. And I'm like, who am I to like, can I curse on this podcast? Like,
yeah, sure. Go for it.
I was just going to say, who am I to shit on someone else's joy, you know? And I think the interesting thing for me is most of the couples I asked, one of the questions I asked was, did you know, that your partner would want this kind of proposal? And most of the time, the person was like, oh yeah, because one woman had actually told her partner she wanted to be proposed to, like, she wanted to be like the spotlight, like the center of attention, like had essentially said, make a big deal about it. Other people were like, we have season tickets, and of course that makes sense. We go to every game together. Another couple had gone on a tour and seen like every NHL arena, and there were two women, and one of the women proposed to the other at their last arena. Like, it just made sense. And I was like, oh, this fits so well. But that was a story that actually came about sort of after I'd written about kiss cams from a similar vein, in like from a consent and coercion point of view, of is there still a place for this? And what's interesting is I sort of came to two different answers on those stories just based on, you know, talking to people about it.
It's funny because I see those proposals and I'm like, no way in hell I'd ever want to do it. But for some people, like, it's their dream.
I mean, when I was a bat boy for the Portland Sea Dogs, someone did it at the Hadlock Field AA Park, which was kind of weak. They asked me to go get a...
Maybe they like love it there. I don't know. Oh my gosh, I talked to this one couple.
It's not that nice. The high school team plays there.
I talked to one couple though who proposed on opening day at Fenway, and it was after they'd won their last championship. And when I talked to the guy, and his fiance is like a huge Red Sox fan, and when I talked to him, he said, well, I knew they were going to get their rings that day, and I just wanted, you know, my girlfriend and the team to get their rings on the same day. And I was like, and then when I talked to her, I was like, oh my God, he knows her so well that it's like the sweetest thing that could have happened for her. So it was a very good example, I think, of just people knowing their partner well enough to know that it was the thing that they would want. I did try to track down the couple. I don't know if y'all remember, a few years ago, there was a proposal at Fenway and the girl said no. And the whole crowd, were you there?
Yeah.
So I found out who he was, because when I was reporting the story, I was telling a friend of mine about it, and he was like, oh, a friend of mine did this, and the girl said no at Fenway, and it was like, oh my God, no, you know that person? And the guy didn't want to talk to me. Unsurprisingly, did not want to be featured in the story, because I was like, that's perfect. It's the other side of like how it can go incredibly wrong.
All right. Well, Britni, we really appreciate your time. That was awesome. Some great insight and some great storytelling, and I'm sure we'll see some for you in the future. And we also look forward to seeing that book in the near future coming up. Thanks so much again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.